So welcome to Fish4Thought for today. I have the honor to introduce our guest for today. His name is Antonio Allegretti. I hope I pronounce it right. It's Italian. He is a senior research associate at Lancaster University in the UK. And he has a background in anthropology and a lot of research experience in East Africa. More specifically in Tanzania, which is where I believe our DG Assam and Antonio already met. And he also has experience in Kenya. And he has done research on the rural livelihoods of pastoralists and also fishing communities, which is an interesting link with what we're all doing here. He also has done some policy-oriented research on climate adaptation and resilience, and also on water management. And my personal connection to Antonio is that, like I said, he works at Lancaster University, which is where I did my PhD, and he works closely with my PhD supervisor, Christina Hicks. And there's another connection between Lancaster University and World Fish, and that is Eddie, who is an honorary professor there. So there's lots of links, and it's great to have Antonio here to visit us and to share with us his research from Kenya towards nutrition-sensitive governance of fisheries in the global south, with, like I said, a focus on Kenya. Without further ado, I'll pass on the mic, well, not this mic, to Antonio, and I'm looking forward to hearing all about it. Thank you.
Thank you. So is the mic working? Is the mic working? Can you hear me well? Okay, good. Thank you very much, Marlene, for the introduction. And thank you all for welcoming me to the organization. It's a pleasure to be here. So as Marlene said, I'm going to talk a little bit about my research in Kenya around fisheries governance and how fisheries governance can become more nutrition sensitive. So this is the list of topics. I will start with a little bit of some figures on global food production and distribution. Then I will move on to the connection with nutrition and hidden hunger. Then I will move on again to fish, the role of fish. And the focus actually of the presentation is nutrition-sensitive governance in the global south. And then I will give you some tales from the field, let's say, Kenya. So we live in the era of food crisis. We know that many different countries experience different forms of malnutrition because of some of the distortions around the food systems. And specifically, vulnerable people are particularly vulnerable to these nutrition-related conditions, like, for instance, children and pregnant women. And something that is not highlighted enough sometimes is the connection between nutrition and lower work productivity, which leads to a reduction of GDP of countries as well. So it's not only about the individual health, but it's also about the economic health of countries as well. This infographic is very interesting and very informative. That's why it's called infographic. So in the bar on the top, you see all the food produced globally per tons per year. So you will see that only a minority of this food is the sort of nutrition-dense and rich food, mostly of animal source, but also vegetable source. Like, for instance, we have eggs and milk and meat, but also legumes and nuts. And around 2/3 of the food produced globally is still important food, of course, because vegetables and fruits are important, but not as rich, nutritionally speaking, as animal products and some vegetable products like nuts and legumes. What's interesting to highlight in this infographic is the sort of distribution of the food that is produced. So we are not talking about production only, but it's important to look at the distribution, so where food goes. Like in this bar at the bottom, we see the patterns of distribution. So we see, for instance, that poorer regions of the world, like Sub-Saharan Africa and South India, get most of their calories from starchy vegetables, which are not as nutritious, of course, as meat and eggs and milk and so on. So they get also in proportion, they get less food as compared to other regions of the world. and also the less nutritious food. So we see that it's not only about, when we talk about food security and nutrition security, it's not only about the availability of food per se, but it's also important to look at how food is distributed, how people access the food. So what this is definitely connected to some of the major nutrition deficiency in the world. So you will see that, like we said before, it's very clear that Africa and South Asia are the most affected regions of the world. Not because there isn't enough food, but because they get the less nutritious food. So for instance, conditions like zinc deficiency, vitamin A deficiency, calcium, and so on. So these regions of the world are fare worse in terms of nutritional outcomes because they get the less nutritious food, not only because they get less food overall. So this is where fish comes in. The role of fish is important, both the actual role, the present role, and also the potential role of fish is important. Fish is already important as a source of protein for 1 billion people, and especially in some of the poorer regions of the world in the tropics. But fish, recent research, including by some people who are in this room, shows that there isn't enough consideration, enough weight given to fish as a source of micronutrients and proteins globally. So our project, Fair Fish, at Lancaster University, it's titled Fair Fish, Hidden Hunger, Forgotten Food. We are trying to tackle the role of fish, both the actual role and the potential role. Ours is a multidisciplinary project. We have 3 work packages tackling different aspects of the role of fish for better nutrition. Some of our scientists are looking at the ecological environmental factors that affect the nutritional content of fish, some of the ecologists. And then we have social scientists like myself looking at the power relations and how these affect access to fish, and also some of the institutional drivers also that affect the overall institutional apparatus that either enables or prevents access to fish. So myself, for instance, I work across these 2 work packages, number 2 and 3. So at Lancaster, together with my colleagues, especially Professor X, who is my line manager, the principal investigator of the project, we have tried to come up with this sort of a framework that we have called nutrition sensitive governance, in a way to create a sort of framework that enables the analysis of the research findings, something very comprehensive that can be used, picked out, in order to critically analyze what we get from the research, with the trademark being getting the right nutrients to those who need them most. So in this framework, we have 3 pillars at 3 different levels. So for instance, pillar number 1 is titled Extending the Boundaries of Fisheries Governance. This is justified by a history of fisheries governance that is very much focused on determining the rights of access to the oceans. So historically, fisheries governance had been always discussed around, who has the right to go into the waters and who doesn't have the right to go into the waters. So in a way, the pre-harvesting and the post-harvesting phases have been left a little bit behind, which means that also critical actors of the fisheries governance have been somehow left a little bit behind, like women, even the poorer ones, like women, the old people who are involved in the processing industry, they sort of left behind in the debates and discussion around fisheries governance. The second pillar is about knowledge. This is also very important because fisheries governance has been dominated by scientific knowledge. But it is also important to account for other forms of knowledge, like the knowledge that is held by local communities and local people in general, and how this creates, for instance, local categorization of fish, not only science-based, but also cultural-based categorization of fish. And this is actually where my research mostly falls within. And the third pillar of this sort of framework is in line with the current debates around the human-centered human-centered image of fisheries, and some of the debates that you're surely familiar with, like human rights, blue degrowth, or blue justice, and so on. So it's important to anchor these debates to the trademark, getting the right nutrients to those who need them most. So this is the framework. And now I'm going to move on to some of the research that I've done as part of this project. I've done research mostly in Kenya, even though the project is also doing some activities in West Africa, in Ghana. But personally, I've worked mostly in Kenya, on the coast of Kenya, southern coast, around Mombasa. This gives a little bit of a picture of the food security related situation in Kenya. So we see that the food security situation has been actually becoming worse over the last few years. So you see that between 2016 and 2021, there is being actually a worsening of the food security situation, and especially on the coast, which is one of the poorest regions in Kenya. So you can see, for instance, in comparison with the average in Africa, Kenya is sort of a little bit worse as compared to Africa, and definitely way higher than the global average. So most of our efforts have been towards, our efforts have not been limited to research only, but we have tried also to sort of build a partnership to sort of foster change, and create some change around the policies, around the management, the governance of the fisheries in the country. So that's also in line with my background, which has been sort of at the crossroads of academic research and also participatory research or policy engagement and so on. So I've tried to do research in a co-production way, in creating some co-production of knowledge rather than the researcher going, and extract information and just writing papers. At least in social sciences, there are many debates around how knowledge should be or could be more democratic and inclusive through systems of co-production of knowledge. And through also iterative processes, hands-on activities, and validation practices. Validation practices meaning doing research and then feeding the research back to the research subjects and getting some feedback from them. So to create this sort of mutual feedback system so that the knowledge becomes more inclusive, let's say, in general. So I've used different methods throughout this couple of years, ever since I started with this project, like ethnographic fieldwork, which is the main system, the main research method used by anthropologists. And I've done also participatory research and learning, education and awareness, and also practical sessions like education, food preparation classes, and so on, because it's also more fun to do these kind of things, and they're also useful to gel sort of community around the objectives that you want to achieve, which in this case is achieving better nutrition for local communities. So I think at this time, maybe we can play that video. So I want to show you a video from the activities that we conducted a couple of months ago. It's a sort of descriptive video, it doesn't have a real story. I mean, and I'm not filmmaker, but it's always good, because videos got a very good impact, different from text, like academic papers and so on. So if possible now to play the video.
Kenya is a developing country in East Africa. It's gifted with amazing natural resources, beautiful national parks, and a rich and diverse culture. The country's economy is developing fast, with improved industries and better infrastructure. Yet, its people are still battling with chronic problems such as unemployment, malnutrition, and environmental degradation. Particularly in the coastal regions, malnutrition is rampant, despite growing efforts by the government. Fisheries of coastal Kenya are crucial resources for the economy of the country and development of the coastal region. They contribute to tourism development and revenues. Yet, their potential for better nutrition is not exploited to the fullest. In February 2023, a team of scientists from Lancaster University visited coastal communities in Shimoni and Wasini Island in the southern coast to investigate the problem of malnutrition in this part of the country. Fair Fish is an initiative by Lancaster University in partnership with the Kenya Marine and Fisheries Research Institute. The project benefits from the expertise of social and natural scientists. While in Kenya, the group of scientists conducted a number of activities such as nutrition education, cooking classes, and workshops, engaging with many stakeholders such as communities, government, and experts. Trainings were conducted for the benefit of the local communities on basic nutritional facts and the potential of fish to improve nutritional status.
Na above all, wako na kitu inaitwa mafuta ya asidi ya omega 3 ama omega 3 fatty acids. Tunapatana?
These sessions were useful to fill knowledge gaps among local women, the nutritionists of the family. After the theory, a hands-on cooking class was organized to practice improved cooking skills.
Kama mtambakisha mkia kama huyu na mnataka kumkula, kausha kabisa mpaka kwa crunch. Ule mwenye unaweza tafuna umeme. Kuna ule mwingine anabaki bado hajaiva huko. We are preparing fish before cooking and we have to scale it first. And as you can see, we are trying to keep our sanitation at par so that we make sure we don't contaminate the fish before we eat it, so that we don't have problems or like running stomach when we are done. Yeah, so this is just the preparation part of it, scaling and cleaning it up, and then we will go later and prepare using different methods, cooking.
The preparation of the fish was a good time to gather some views from community members on the benefits of fish consumption and the lessons learned during the trainings.
Tunapenda samaki sana kwa sababu ni kati ya lishe bora na pia ni chakula ambacho kinatengeneza akili ya ubongo wa mtoto mdogo na pia inachangia pia katika ukuaji wa kutengeneza mifupa kwa watoto na pia kutengeneza akili nzuri kwa watu wazima. Tangia Jumatatu nimepata fursa ya kujumuika na wenzangu katika mafunzo hayo na nimeona kwamba tulikuwa tunatumia samaki tu kama chakula tu cha kawaida, lakini kumbe samaki ni muhimu sana katika mwili wa binadamu.
Also, experts and leaders expressed their views on the nutrition-related problems, the challenges and opportunities for the fisheries sector in the region, and the successes of Fair Fish.
Changamoto zenye zinapatikana katika jamii hapa nadhani ni utapiamlo, muda mwingi na jinsi ya kujua jinsi ya kupika vyakula. Vyakula wanaweza kuwa wanavipata ambapo ni samaki na vingine, lakini jinsi ya kupika inakuwa hawajajua vizuri. Mradi wa Fair Fish nadhani umesaidia pakubwa, maana umeeleza watu jinsi ya kupika na madini yanayopatikana katika samaki sana, ambapo watu hawajui kama kipande kipi cha samaki kinafaa kupewa nani ama nani anafaa kula, lakini jinsi mradi umekuja umesaidia sana, tumejua manufaa ya samaki na jinsi anavyostahili kupikwa na mengi zaidi, na natumai tutazingatia.
After the cooking and the eating, it was time to call it a day and prepare for the following activities. Lectures and roundtable discussions were organized with different stakeholders to further delve into the problem of malnutrition and discuss possible solutions.
We expect to see a community that is well fed, a community that has enough food, a community that has access to some of the basic requirements that they should.
Food is key. It's one of the basic needs in the society, just like clothing and shelter. In Kenya, we are taught three things to our primary basic needs: food, clothing, and shelter. This falls within the category of food, and so nutrition.
Even the prevalence of anemia amongst the pregnant and lactating mothers within our health facilities, you'll find that over 90% of our mothers who comes at ANC clinics. You'll find them with no HB.
Then it was time for a field visit to Mkwiru village in Wasini Island to explore the local fisheries resources and gel the community of stakeholders around nutrition-related governance agendas. On Wasini Island, the team of scientists were welcomed by the local leaders, then moved on to a crucial site for fishing and seaweed farming.
We are proceeding to a site where women farm seaweed as an income generation activity. It's a sort of conservation site for women to earn some extra income.
On site, the group had the opportunity to enjoy the landscape, and different stakeholders learned about the local resources while sharing their knowledge and expertise.
So just like plants, the fish is as nutritious as the environment. So naona kama plants, if you grow it in a soil that is rich in nutrients, it will be healthier. Yeah, so that means the environment, that's why the conservation comes in place.
On the perspective of conservation, we encourage people to go after the big fish or the big coral reef fish for this matter, because most of these fishermen who are here, they normally fish in the coral reef areas. They don't go to the deep sea because they lack the equipment to do so. Now, if they go for the small fish, which are the juveniles, then they are going to deplete the entire fishing species, because if we go to for the juveniles, then it means tomorrow you will not have the big fish, so that the fishing industry can sustainably move on.
Good nutrition is crucial for human well-being. Feeding communities is a difficult job that requires concerted efforts by all stakeholders, but the road ahead is promising.
Yeah, so it's just a little movie. I mean, it's not the video per se that is important. It's just that sort of creates a sense of shared mission for the people who participate in it. So it's a tool rather than an end, you know. So by sharing this video again, you know, by feeding it back to the people who have been participating in it, you know, we are trying to create this sort of partnership or platform for fostering change. Because, you know, we put together people from different national agencies like the Kenya Wildlife Service, is it? Yeah, the Conservation Agency in Kenya, the Coast Guard, you know, so some of the people who actually make decisions around the local management of the fisheries resources, even the ocean at large. So I want to pick up on something that towards the end of the video, you saw maybe, if you remember, a guy, you know, picking up the fish and showing, you know, this is small fish, this is large fish. I don't know if you remember something like that. That's very interesting, actually, because that actually gives me the opportunity to move on to the more ethnographic research that I've done in Kenya into the local categories of fish, as opposed to the science-based sort of management or categories as well of fish. So I've done ethnographic research, which is this methods, you know, that anthropologists use normally historically, which means just going in a place and stay there for as long as it takes, just recording what people do or people say. That's basically what ethnographic fieldwork is. So I've done ethnographic fieldwork in along the coast, of course, in 2 different regions, north of Mombasa and south of Mombasa. I will say why I decided to do sort of comparative analysis. So I've looked at the practices of fish management, local management, because looking at the practices, what actually people do is important to understand, the local values, the local knowledge that underlies, the management, and that actually goes on the ground. And also fits back into what I showed you before, the first pillar of the nutrition sensitive governance around involving all phases of the value chain of fisheries rather than just focusing on the rights of access into the water. So involving as well the post-harvesting phase of fisheries. So I've looked at the practices of counting fish, measuring fish, weighing, and sorting, allocating. These are practices that are not really paid attention to when it comes to the formal sort of management, science-based management by local government or national government, because they use mostly science data around species, around kgs. They don't pay much attention at the local practices. So that's what I've been doing in Kenya, looking at the local practices, and what came out of this ethnographic fieldwork was this sort of system of local grading, which is different from the more like scientific grading, which is done as well by the government of Kenya. And I came out with these ideas. It's not that I came out, just myself, because I saw them. Ideas of small fish and large fish, which in a way intersects the species and the size weight, which are more like science-based categories. So people use this sort of local categorization of fish around small and large fish. So you can see here the bundles of fish. This one is small, it's a small bundle of fish. This one is a large bundle of fish or a bundle of large fish. And as I said, they are very different from the way the local government collects data on fish, which is mostly organized around a species here and kg. So these are different categories that are used by local people. So these are bundles of fish, of course, tangible bundles of fish, but they're also bundles of value and practices, and also negotiations, because these categories of small and large are not fixed categories. They're not fish species, right? They're more like local categories of fish, and they are more subject to negotiations. And these negotiations are around the very category of small and large, so even small fish can be subject to negotiations that become large fish and vice versa. I'm not messing with you, but that's actually what happens. There are negotiations and power relations around what fish is categorized as small and what fish is categorized as large. So small fish is the fish that is usually good for local processing. So for instance, when it comes to cooking, the small fish is the fish that is tasty and is well cooked, when you using the local processing systems, like frying, for instance, by the mama karanga. Mama karanga are these local women who process fish for as business, as food. And small fish as well goes also beyond species. So people refer to small fish as changu or tafi, which are the Swahili names. Swahili is the language of Kenya. Swahili names for scavenger and rabbit fish. But actually, small fish includes a lot of different species that people don't really talk about. They refer to changu and tafi as small fish, but small fish includes many other different species in the region. Small fish is considered a fish for the household, so not fish that should go to markets, but fish that should go to feed children and the family and so on. On the other hand, large fish is the fish that is considered for business, the fish that should fetch money, and the fish that requires professional cooking skills, like the kind of cooking skills that professional chefs have in the hotels and the lodges. And So there are some conditions that determine this power relations and negotiations around what small fish is and what large fish is. And some of these conditions are of geographical nature. So for instance, as I said before, I did sort of comparative analysis between Shimoni and Watamu, which are the two regions south of Mombasa and north of Mombasa. These are two regions that are very different because in terms of resources, overall resources, overall development, and also as fisheries resources. So in Shimoni, there are less resources, both fisheries resources and overall development resources, whereas Watamu and Malindi are, probably you have heard about these regions, they are very touristic, they attract a lot of tourists from all over the world, So these conditions that determine these negotiations are of geographical nature. So for instance, in Shimoni, small fish and large fish is handled in the same place, which is the BMU, which stands for Beach Management Unit, which is the main unit of management that puts together government and community. In Watamu, there is physical separation, which means also marginalization of people who handle small fish. And GIA is another condition that creates these negotiations and power relations. So in Shimoni, there is more artisanal GIA, which fetches more small fish, while in the Watamu and Malindi, there is more advanced GIA, and people can go, the fishermen can go in the open ocean and fish larger pelagic fish. And the seasonality as well is different. In the resource-poor context, small fish is fished all year round, while in Watamu, it's only the migrant fishermen who come to Kenya on a season base, let's say. So there isn't small fish available at all times. So what I'm trying to say here is that resources, when it comes to production of fish, is not the only thing that we should pay attention to, because in a context where there are more resources, there is more development, most of the fish that is caught doesn't really go to the local households, to the local communities, because it's large fish. It's the fish that usually goes to lodges and hotels, and it's also exported outside of the country. While at the same time, Shimoni is less rich, there are less resources, and overall development is lower. But because of these conditions here, more fish, the small fish goes into the local markets, it's more accessible to the local communities, to the local people, to the vulnerable people. So what I'm trying to say here is that the end point of this, I guess, the key message of this is that a growth approach to governance of fisheries doesn't necessarily lead to better access for fish by the people who actually needs it most. So that fits back again to the trademark of nutrition sensitive governance, which is getting the right nutrients to those who need them most. So a growth approach, growth is important, of course, but is not all that we should take care of. Also, access and distribution are important. And that's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Antonio. Great presentation, and great to have the video as well. I think that made it really visual. I guess we'll just sit down here. I'm sure there will be some questions from. I have a few questions, but I'll ask first if anyone else has any questions for Antonio.
Thanks for the presentation. The question I had was if we are going to focus on the growth of the small fishes or that group, because it leads to better targeting of where the nutrition impact is potentially going to be in local consumption and addressing the nutritional deficiencies of that population. To what extent do we know about expanding that? Is that going to impact the ecological balance in a sense, the level of exploitation of the small fishes? Because there's no separation, as you said, between species, so it could be younger fish as well, although the wildlife person seemed to say in the video that we discourage fishing small fishes, but at the same time, you're seeing that small fishes play an important role from a nutrition point of view, but from a wildlife conservation point of view, it seems there's some contradictions there. Are you looking into that? Do you have any insights there?
Yeah, I think if there's any more questions, we can take one more question now, and then Antonio will answer. Yes.
Yes, excellent. Thanks for that excellent presentation, Antonio. I guess in a way I'm continuing the previous question. In terms of the small fish versus large fish, yes, there was the Kenyan Wildlife Service guy saying we promote the catching of large fish, which is a very colonial narrative that really doesn't key into ecosystem-based fisheries management. So the small end of the fish system is far more productive than the large end of the fish system. And so promoting the catching of small fish in many ways is a far more ecologically sustainable approach. But that aside, my question was really sort of in the Kenyan context. I know some of the big international environmental NGOs have a big foothold over there. And I was just wondering where you see the power dynamic of those dueling narratives playing out. So you'll have this colonial narrative coming through from the bingos saying size limits catch the big fish, and we have this nutrition sensitive narrative which says small fish actually get to the people who need it. So politically, where are the dollars in that, I guess, and how is that going to play out in terms of policy in the Kenyan context? Thanks.
Yeah, great questions, Antonio.
Somehow I feel that the microphone is not working. Is it working? It's working, okay. When it comes to the growth of the small fish sector, I don't think that's a good way. I mean, I don't think we should put it in those terms, in the sense that I'm not really talking about growth of the small scale of the small fish sector. It's more like creating the policy environment for this niche fishery to continue more on a sustainable way. Like for instance, in the richer region of Watamu Malindi, there aren't fishermen who are actually exploiting this sort of niche fishery, because a lot of fishermen are going to the more lucrative business. So having some policies that, like for instance, help the migrant fishermen to conduct business without fearing, to be kicked away from the country. That would be a sort of policy measure that will help the sector of the small fish to at least to continue all year round, so that people can access the small fish all year round, rather than only during the season when there are migrant fishermen on the Kenyan coast. And when I say small fish, I don't really mean the juveniles, because, as I said, these categories are flexible. Small doesn't necessarily mean small. You can take a big fish, which is considered small because it's good for it's cooked well, by the local women, so they consider it small, but it's not actually small. Even to the naked eye, you can see that it's actually a big fish. It's not a juvenile. So these categories are very interesting because you can play around with these categories and make sure that more fish goes to the people who need it most, not necessarily the juveniles. I know it's a kind of borderline category, small. It could be confused with the juveniles, which of course is terrible. We don't want to fish the juveniles. But it's important. What I'm saying, it's important to be aware of these local categories of fish, because that's actually what people do. And if you impose some sort of categories that people don't recognize, like even the species, not everybody is very knowledgeable about species in the villages. So it's important to be aware. It's important there is this cross-fertilization of ideas when it comes to local management. Science is important, but local categorizations and local knowledge is also important. But I don't know if that answers both questions.
I think so.
I think so,
yeah, and I think it raises another question that I've been thinking about, and I think David alluded to it as well, about sort of power dynamics of who gets to decide. In this case, in the research project, you're doing co-production, working with various agencies and organizations that all have different stakes in this region. And how did you navigate those existing power dynamics when entering into a co-production partnership with all of them, and how that also influenced the kinds of research questions that you were asking?
Yeah, I mean, it's important to be honest in the case when it comes to co-production of knowledge, meaning that you don't have to pretend that everybody will have the same power, you know. I mean, if you read the literature on co-production of knowledge, there is always this narrative around giving voice to the people, you know, making the whole process democratic and inclusive. But of course, the power relations are there, you know, so you have to acknowledge them. So, for instance, when we had workshops, we gave the first slots to the scientists. You know, we had presentations like science-based presentations, because it would be weird to start with the presentations by the local people. You know, people would laugh, you know, because they don't expect that. But it's important to acknowledge that there are hierarchies, there are power relations. Some people have more decision-making power. Of course, you cannot compare NGOs and the Kenya Wildlife Service. Of course, the conservation agencies or the Coast Guard, the local government, they have more power, and it's important to acknowledge that. You don't want to disrupt the system. You know, you have to acknowledge the system has got power relations, and then slowly, you know, start questioning it and tearing it apart or some way, let's say. So that's what we tried to do, you know, when we did a workshop, for instance, in February in Kenya. We started with these science-based presentations, and then we came in with the experience of local fishermen and local women, and they gave their experiences of managing fish, what is important to them, what sort of knowledge they draw on when they manage the local resources. Yeah.
Thanks. Any more questions? I think.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much, Antonio Allegretti. Asante sana. I don't know how many people in the room know that you speak fluent Swahili. So Antonio and
now they do.
Now we do, exactly. We met in, I think it was 2012 in Arusha.
Maybe 11. I
think, yes, 2011 in Arusha, when we were working on economic valuation of pastoral meat production system in Arusha. And I remember Antonio taking me sort of to the proper hood where he used to hang out, you know, as a proper anthropologist, and immensely enjoyed, you know, eating nyama choma and what have you. Really learned a lot then spending time with you, Antonio. So thank you. But also, I think my experience there in Arusha brought back some memories. You know, when we were talking to one of the pastoralists there from the Maasai community. I cannot remember Muzei, someone, you know, one of those men from TNRF who said, I wouldn't want my children to become pastoralists, right? So I guess since then I've always been thinking about, you know, the assumption that we make that, you know, people want to perpetuate and continue on their lifestyle. Yes, in the southern part of Mombasa, as you said, you know, people are consuming small fish, but I also wonder whether that's by choice or is it because they have limited capacities, mostly because of, you know, you've described the different gears and others that they use. The harvest is very limited, therefore they are subjected to that. So the question is, do we argue in favor of policies or governance structures that would perpetuate this consumption of small fish remaining small and, you know, or do we promote policy instruments that would bring about a desired transformation in those communities so they become more profitable and, you know, prosperous, etc. I think it goes back to that point that Dave Mills made about, you know, this colonial attitude, for lack of a better expression, which is, you know, we make the assumption that, yes, that's the lifestyle they want, and therefore we'll design policies and we'll give policy advices that will perpetuate that. But is that really what they want? That's the question I have, Antonio. And I don't think there's any right or wrong answer, but I just thought, you know, just put it out there. Thank you.
I mean, personally, as a researcher was been in the field, for a few years now. It's been almost 20 years since I started my research, starting with pastoralism and then now went into fishing. I realized that change happens so slowly. So I tend not to be in favor of huge transformations when it comes to the policy environment. I think huge transformations don't really happen that easily. So I think it's important to start with small changes that can actually make a big difference. So achieving a lot, investing little. I think that's possible, because some of the narratives and debates around natural resources management, both pastoralism and fisheries, date back, like decades. I think some people are still talking about tragedy of commons, as you know, and that's something that was discussed like 60 years ago. So I think transformations, unless there are specific situations. But usually I'm more in favor of small changes, and I guess the question of preference and taste, becomes in this situation a little bit more secondary. I think it's important to fill the gaps that are urgent, and important to fill, and then afterwards you can, once you have tackled the emergencies, the urgency of a certain situation, like could be malnutrition, for instance. The coastal Kenya is actually, the malnutrition situation requires urgent action. So that's something that can come. The transformation can come afterwards. I think the first step should be small changes for immediate goals or short-term goals, at least. That's my opinion. I don't know what you think about it.
Yeah, thank you. And do you reckon, I guess related to this, sometimes it's, I wonder if policy is also always catching up with what is already happening in reality anyway, but that's probably another discussion. I think there's a question online.
Yeah, thanks.
I'll have to.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can.
Okay, good. Thank you, Antonio. A couple of questions. One, the Eat Lancet Commission proposed the planetary health diet, and the criticism of that is that it didn't address the issue of affordability. And in many countries, developing countries, people can't afford fish of good quality. And in countries like the UK, the national dietary guidelines following the Eat Lancet planetary health diet are not followed because people eat too much starchy food, too much red meat, and not enough fish. So clearly, I think there's a need for behavioral change. And coupled with that, in countries like Peru, where they produce around 400,000, sometimes 1 million tons of super prime fish meal for the aquaculture industry, all of those fish could go for direct human consumption, and you would probably solve the dietary problems in sub-Saharan Africa just with that one single source. But obviously there are perverse business requirements requiring super prime fish meal. So my question is, do you agree that one, we need to promote more behavioral change in the way people look at their diets, especially in both developing and developed countries? And two, should we focus more on the improved use of pelagic fish to ensure that they don't end up as fish meal or so-called trash fish? Over.
Okay, I'm not really sure I got the point of the question.
The first question was related to the fact that a lot of people can't afford fish, and there needs to be a behavioral change towards eating the kind of fish that they may be able to afford. And the other question is that there's a lot of fish available which could be for direct human consumption, but it is going to indirect human consumption, i.e. fish meal. So what, if anything, can we do in terms of behavioral change and a shift away from the use of pelagic fish, small pelagic fish, as a fish food? Over.
I mean, when it comes to behavioral change, I don't think I talked in terms of people not eating what they want. I think that, I mean, at least, referring to my own research here, I think people like what they are eating, so I don't think there is any need for behavioral change there. I think there is more needed around improving the access to what people are already eating, which they like. So I wouldn't say we need behavioral change in that case. And the second one, yeah, definitely there is the issue of fish used, not for human consumption. Not much in East Africa, actually. For instance, I've done a bit of research in West Africa as well, in Ghana, where the issue of fish meal is much more important. A lot of the fish goes to fish powder, for feeding livestock and so on. But I don't think I have a strong opinion about that. I guess, that's outside of the scope of what I've been doing so far, yeah.
Thanks, Antonio.
Okay. Thanks very much for the question, and thanks, Antonio, for the answer. There might be more questions, but we're out of time. So I think we should round off here and thank Antonio for his visit. He's been here for a week. It's been really great to interact in person, not just online. And I think we'll probably stay in touch and keep collaborating as well, which is great. Safe travels to the conference next week. Thank you very much for joining us here. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.